Welcome to this journey into one of the most unsettling cases in the history of the United States. Before we begin, I encourage you to comment where you are listening from and the exact time you are tuning in. It's always chilling to see how far and at what hours these stories travel. The auction block at Johnson Square was unusually full that spring morning in 1846. Savannah's wealthy had gathered, parasols and handkerchiefs in hand, shielding themselves not just from the Georgia sun, but from the stench of the unwashed crowd. Elizabeth Mount stood slightly apart from the others, her morning dress a stark contrast against the white linen suits and colorful gowns around her. 6 months after becoming a widow, she had finally left the seclusion of her home, not for social calls or church, but for a matter of stark practicality. The Mount Plantation, 7 miles outside Savannah, needed hands, and Elizabeth needed someone strong to tame the disorder her late husband had left sown into the fields. The auctioneer's voice rang out over the square, weighing human lives in the same brisk cadence one would use for a lot of horses: muscle, teeth, endurance, each quality recited to the rhythm of a practiced patter. Elizabeth watched with a clinical eye, gloved fingers tight around a small leather notebook where she'd been scratching tallies since dawn. Her inheritance was large, but not limitless. Each figure, each bid, leaned against the invisible column of "Survive the Year." When Lot 17 was brought forward, the crowd fell into that particular hush that begins with curiosity and ends in discomfort. The man stood tall, shoulders squared despite the iron at his wrists. His skin was darker than most, so deep a blue-black that the morning light seemed to drink it in, and thin, deliberate scars marked his chest in patterns too precise to be the work of a whip. His eyes were what caught and held, amber, unsettlingly clear, meeting the horizon without flinching as if measuring it. A prime field hand. "Answers to Isaiah." "About 30, the auctioneer called, his tone dimming half a step as though a tune he preferred not to hum had crept into his throat. "Strong back, good teeth, no visible illness. Trained in tobacco." A pause and then, almost as confession, "Previous owner deceased. Sold as part of a state settlement," fans whispered behind gloved knuckles. A banker's wife muttered to another, and both women turned away as if his gaze might cling. Bidding opened to a silence so complete, the clop of a passing dray horse sounded like a hammer. The auctioneer lowered the figure, then lowered it again. Still no paddle lifted. 200, Elizabeth said. Calm, even, like the click of a lock engaging. Relief softened the auctioneer's jaw. 200 from Mrs. Mount. Do I hear 250? No answer. The crowd avoided eye contact with both buyer and man. Going once, twice? Sold to Mrs. Elizabeth Mount for 200. At the ledger table, Margaret Harrington, banker's wife, keeper of social weather, leaned close, breath sugared with peppermint. "You should know, Lizzie. 3rd time he's been sold in 2 years. Each master met with misfortune." "I'm not superstitious, Margaret," Elizabeth replied, signing where the clerk tapped. "And prudence loves a bargain." The ink barely dried when the decision began its long echo. The carriage rattled out of town past salt-bitten oaks. Elizabeth sat upright, spine a metronome against the swaying, while Isaiah rode the rear platform, palms easy on the rail. The Mount House rose from the road like a memory of grandeur. Tall columns, broad veranda, now chapped by neglect. Paint flaked, hedges bulged, the garden drooped beneath its own weeds. From the upstairs windows, the fields showed their wounds plainly. Rose torn, soil tired, a kind of dullness in the green. "My husband passed in November," she said at last, eyes forward. The overseer left soon after. Took 3 of our best hands with him. Those remaining are house servants or past their years. You have tobacco experience. You'll manage the fields and the 4 still able to work. Port to me, not to the house." A small nod from the rear platform, barely a movement, yet unmistakably precise. She continued, "Your quarters will be the cabin at the northern edge. The former overseers. Work begins at dawn." At the steps, an older black man appeared from the side yard, wiping earth from his fingers with a cloth too clean to be his own. "Malachi will show you your quarters," Elizabeth said, and then, as though assigning noon to a clock face, 7 o'clock in the study for a survey of the fields. That evening, the diary took its first notation of consequence. "Acquired new field hand today. Isaiah, about 30. Unusual appearance, capable. Purchased below market. Concerning perhaps, but sound. Margaret Harrington offered a warning. Superstitions about former owners. Irrelevant. Tomorrow will prove the investment. The diary could not record the whisper in the kitchen. That one's not right, Malachi told Bessie as he trimmed onion tops. Those marks on his chest, ritual, not whipping. My grandmother said men who wore such marks weren't entirely... Here. Bessie kneaded dough a shade too hard. Hush, Miss Elizabeth's brittle. Don't fetch more worry. Malachi's voice fell further. First master found in bed, eyes open and empty. Second walked into the river fully clothed. Third might put a pistol to his own studies. After each, the man was sold. Quietly. At 7 precisely, Isaiah crossed the yard with the calm economy of a man who wastes neither step nor breath. He stood in what had been Colonel Mount's study. Now a room with hunting prints replaced by botanical plates, ledgers squared to edges. Elizabeth unrolled a hand-drawn map across the desk. Soil's poor. The crops failing. These are the divisions. Here, the worst. Isaiah's gaze tracked the sketched rows as if seeing the ground beneath the paper. When he spoke, the words were measured, the consonants set like stones. Rotation is wrong, he said, fingertip resting on a rectangle. Tobacco takes without giving. Last season should have been legumes. These sections need rest and nitrogen returns. The ridge by the creek, good for your cover. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't presumption. It was knowledge, coins counted in a different purse. Elizabeth felt the argument rise in her. Class, custom, order, and then fold itself away. Economic needs must outweigh tradition, she would write that night. He is precise. Understands soil and cycle. Clarity unusual for one of his station. I will grant authority where efficiency demands it. 2 weeks turned like a key. The rows straightened. Tools found their users rather than the other way around. Isaiah worked in the sun among the hands, not above them, demonstrating the cut of a stem here, the shadow a leaf should throw there. He gave tasks to strengths instead of to habits. The men and women took to it with a relief that looked like pride on some faces and like caution on others. Yet the house changed too, subtly, like a draft under a door. The staff moved differently when Isaiah's shadow crossed a threshold. Eyes dropped not from respect, but from an old instinctive worry not teachable in a parlor. Only Malachi spoke to him at length, their twilight conversations trimmed to silence the moment anyone else's foot creaked a floorboard. By early June, the fields began to look ended. The color in the leaves deepened from fatigue to vigor. Elizabeth found herself at the study window more often, the ledger forgotten open to yesterday's sums, as she watched the small choreography of labor calibrate to one man's quiet tempo. At night, sleep arrived with images, those scars on Isaiah's chest, not random but written, arranging themselves into almost words in a language that brushed her memory without ever landing. She woke with the shapes in her fingertips as though she'd been tracing them. Excuses arrived. I will need a weekly update, she told him. Then twice weekly. Then, join me in the conservatory. As if the room itself, her husband's dismissed indulgence of warm glass and palms, gave permission for a different kind of conversation. Between pages of her diary, she began pressing leaves Isaiah named in a voice like a low hymn, cowpea, indigo, a wetland root she could not spell, labeling them provided by IB. The first time she wrote only initials. Her pen paused and some small barrier shifted. Rumor, the swiftest courier in any county, did its laps beyond the gate. In the house it moved slower and wore charms. Sarah, only 12 when she'd first heard her father's whisper, and now elevated to Elizabeth's personal maid after the previous girl fled with a muttered sickness, heard quiet talk in the conservatory. Old ways, across the sea, what the colonel forced and what the land will give if asked. Once, entering with a pitcher, she froze. Elizabeth was studying one of Isaiah's forearm scars. Sleeves rolled, gloves discarded. Fingertips following the lines with something Sarah would later call a hungry carefulness. The moment shattered when they noticed her. The air rearranging itself into propriety as easily as a shawl is thrown over bare shoulders. There were other small alterations. Deliveries began to stop at the gate instead of the porch. Elizabeth pled illness to callers and answered business with letters instead of tea. At dusk, the field edges smelled unusually sweet, tobacco's breath lengthened by something darker beneath it, like fruit left too long in a warm room. Birds began to avoid a certain swale behind the northern cabin, skirting it in jittery arcs. On the last day of June, Elizabeth wrote one line 3 times before blotting 2 of them out. Efficiency demands central control. On July 1st, she spoke it aloud. Malachi, suddenly and without ceremony, was relieved as head of household. Isaiah, by ledger entry and sealed instruction, took charge of both fields and house. Silence is not a sound but a pressure. The kitchen wore it all afternoon. That night, 2 younger servants vanished into it rather than sleep under it. They were never recovered. Elizabeth's hand grew more fluent in her book. IB has shown me the meaning carried in flesh, knowledge kept in marks where no thief can steal it. The colonel sought force. This land answers focus. The soil must be prepared as minds must be prepared. My lines are steadier now when I draw the symbols. She did not record where she drew them. The plantation began to fold in on itself like a letter being sealed. Fewer footsteps crossed the veranda. Paths through the canebrake near the creek shifted, or felt as though they had. Landmarks that once stood willing to be found now seemed to move half a pace to the left of memory. Hands who had worked those acres for years found themselves pausing at corners where there had never been corners before. The tobacco took to the changes with a vigor that made even the skeptical pause. Leaves thickened to a luster that reflected dusk like oil. Stalks rose an inch taller than men who'd spent a lifetime judging height at a glance. When wind went through them, it carried not only the usual riffling sound, but a whisper just barely shaped enough to suspect syllables. At night, the conservatory windows held twin silhouettes, the straight line of a woman's back, the taller, steadier column of a man beside her, bent over a table where copper, clay, and plant stems lay in an arrangement that looked accidental to those who did not know patterns, and inevitable to those who did. On the far shelf, Elizabeth kept a small brass bowl polished to a perpetual glow. When the moon angled right, it cupped the light as if saving it. Sarah, curious despite the burden of her father's warnings, once lingered beyond the door and heard a sentence she never forgot, though she would struggle to say it aloud in the years to come. "Power is not taken," Isaiah was saying, voice low enough that the panes did not rattle. "It is returned to its path." Elizabeth's answer was softer still. "Then show me the path. More entries. Shorter, faster, like steps quickening toward a place not named. We have begun preparations." The land answers. The timing must be exact. Outside the bound paper of her thoughts, the practical world continued to tick. Ledgers balanced. Orders arrived. The sun swung and fell. But within the house, within the fields, within Elizabeth, a different clock had started. By the 2nd week of July, the staff wore small pouches at their throats, salt and iron nails. A grandmother's science pressed into present fear. Windowsills collected lines of dried herbs that had no place in town recipes. Doors were locked with a fervor that had nothing to do with thieves. And still the work continued. Mornings were rows and sweat and measurable yield. Afternoons were lists and jars and drawings. Evenings were the conservatory where palms stirred to voices that had no wind to move them. If you are listening to Liturgy of Fear, hear this before we step further. Some stories do not twist suddenly. They tighten by degrees. A bargain is often just a choice that keeps being chosen. On the night before harvest calculations were due, Elizabeth sat alone at the study desk, her pen paused above a blank line. Through the window she could see the northern cabin's faint lamplight. Between here and there lay the field, green made almost black by moonlight, a wide sea with slow breathing. For a long time she listened to that breath. Then she dipped the pen again and wrote a single sentence that would look innocuous to any clerk and momentous to anyone who understood the weight of authority. All operations to report through IB outside. A dog howled once, then seemed to swallow its own voice. The night resumed its shape as if nothing at all had moved. The change on July 1st was not an announcement. It was a hinge. Doors that once swung 2 ways now moved only 1. Malachi folded his apron without protest and placed the ring of keys on the study desk. By evening, Isaiah held authority over fields and house. and the plantation adjusted to his quiet cadence, the way a river accepts a new bend. Slowly, then all at once. Deliveries stopped at the veranda. Teamsters left crates at the iron gate and took payment folded into sealed envelopes, never asking why. Elizabeth replied to every caller by letter. The same neat hand, regrets, illness, business by correspondence only. The world beyond the live oaks might have continued, but Mount curled inward like a leaf under too much sun. The fields refused to wither. Tobacco rose with a vigor bordering on indecent, leaves glossy enough to throw back dusk. A sweetness began to settle over the rose in late afternoon. Familiar at first, then too rich. Ripe the way a room feels when fruit has been left to think about itself for days. Birds skirted the northern swale in jittery arcs. Dogs along the lane woke as if to a sound too low for names. Barked once, then fell into listening. Inside, the conservatory became a second study. A grammar of copper bowls and clay jars. Stems aligned as if the table were a page. Knights found the silhouettes of two forms at the long workbench. A straight-backed woman, a tall, still man beside her. Words traveled between them like measured drops. "Power isn't taken," Isaiah said once, and the palms along the glass trembled, though no wind crept under the sashes. "It's returned to its path." Elizabeth's answer was near a whisper. "Then show me the path." She pressed leaves between diary pages and labeled them with steady hands. Cowpea, indigo, wetland root, IB. She drew symbols, lines crisp where they had once wavered, and did not write where she had learned them. The initials appeared more often now, a quiet admission inked in margins. Timing, alignment, soil. The house staff answered with old protections because there were no new ones at hand. Little cloth pouches of salt and iron nails hung at throats. Window sills collected herbs that belonged to no cookbook. Doors were latched early, not against thieves, but against the kind of night that stands too close to the panes and listens. Sarah, 12 when she first heard Malachi's warning, now Elizabeth's attendant, moved with a girl's care and a witness's memory. She heard words that did not belong to parlor rooms, old ways, crossings, offerings the land would accept if asked instead of forced. 2 servants slipped away after dusk, leaving their pallets smooth and their footfalls lighter than breath. No patrol found them. No roomer returned them. In the kitchen, the absence made a shape of its own. Days kept a practical ledger. Isaiah was everywhere at once without appearing to hurry. At the ridge, showing how a blade bites a stalk without bruising. By the shed, setting tools in a logic no one argued with. At the well, explaining how a cover crop would pay back what tobacco spent without mercy. Hands who had spent years learning how to endure learn it again how to do. Yield followed obedience. Pride followed yield, though it wore caution like a coat. Nights kept a different book. Elizabeth wrote in it without ink. She slept less. When she did, her dreams developed a language. The scars on Isaiah's chest, too deliberate to be punishment, came as script, rearranging themselves until the lines were not merely seen but read. She woke with the shapes in her fingers, as if she had traced them in sleep across her own skin. The land noticed. Paths near the creek slipped half a yard to the left of memory. Men who could find a boundary stone blindfolded paused and frowned at corners that shouldn't exist. A measuring chain stretched the same number of links, yet the distance refused to be the distance it had been. The map on Elizabeth's desk stayed faithful. The ground it described did not. Reports became patterns. A hen went broody and refused feed, head cocked as if listening to speech in the rafters. A mule stood for an hour at the field's edge without blinking. Once near twilight, a boy swore he heard his name breathed from the rows in a voice that was his grandmother's, but she'd been dead 3 winters. The diary entries shortened and quickened. We prepare. The land answers. Timing must be precise. The brass bowl in the conservatory never lost its shine. When the moon angled right, it held light the way a cupped hand holds water, still and deeper than it looked. Sarah saw what she was not meant to, the way a house always offers a child certain vantage. Through the conservatory door, left a finger's width for air, she watched Elizabeth roll Isaiah's sleeve and trace a forearm scar with bare fingers, not unkind, not timid, a study conducted like prayer. When they saw her, Propriety slid back into place with a practiced ease. The glove tugged, the cuff smoothed, the sentence finished as if it had been about crop weights. Malachi had fewer duties and more watching. He went to the northern cabin one night with a lantern hooded low and came back before the flame could gutter, face set to stillness. He did not say what had sent him stepping backward into the yard. He only tacked a sprig of evergreen above the doorframe and told Sarah in a voice too steady, "After dark, stay where the iron is." By mid-August, the plantation wore distance like weather. Letters went out. Crates came in. Voices flattened when they crossed certain thresholds. The sweet smell at the row's edge thickened, and a second scent threaded it, something like damp wood lifted from river-bottom silt, like the breath of leaves left to compost with intention. No one named it aloud. That same month, the kitchen noticed changes Elizabeth did not record. She ate less of what Bessie prepared, and more of what Isaiah brought in small bundles. Roots shaped like knuckles, berries the color of dried blood, a stalk that bled milk into a clay pot simmering on low flame. Once, when Bessie lifted the lid to air the room, a steam rose that left her palms stippled with a rash shaped like tiny, perfect ovals, marks that would not fade. The first animal deaths did not look like violence. Small bodies, sparrows, a barn cat, were found without wound and with their eyes filmed over white. A calf wandered onto Mount property from a neighbor's pasture and returned 2 weeks later, sleek and strong but wrong. It stood facing a blank wall for whole afternoons, tail still, ears tilted to something no one else could hear. Elizabeth's writing sharpened to points. The soil must be prepared as minds must be prepared. The symbols hold. The schedule holds. She stopped noting callers. She stopped noting weather. She underlined dates. In the study, the plantation ledgers marched on in neat columns. Bales, weights, costs, receipts, numbers offering comfort to anyone who needed the world to be a place where sums balance. In the conservatory, a different math solved itself. The brass bowl, a clay jar soot dark at the rim, a ring of tobacco stems carved faintly along their outer skin, marks no one but the carver would have noticed. When wind moved through the field the next evening, the leaves whispered not merely sound but shape. Those near the stems with marks heard their own names inside the susurrus. No one admitted it. Sarah dreamed when she finally slept. In one dream, she stood in the field under a moon clean as bone and watched the leaves breathe. With each rise and fall, smoke lifted from the veins as if the plants themselves remembered something that needed to be spoken and could only be spoken as vapor. In another, she opened the conservatory door and found the room gone and the sea in its place, a long horizon, and a ship that did not move though the water did. She woke with salt at the back of her throat. Elizabeth walked the grounds barefooted twice that month, returning at dawn with soil kissing her ankles and bits of plant clinging to her skirts. She did not bother with explanations. In the diary she wrote only, "Alignment approaches." Her hands no longer shook when she drew. On a Thursday of no special note to the county, she dismissed the staff early with extra rations, told them to keep to their quarters, and had Malachi bar the kitchen door from the inside. She set 2 candles in the study, picked up the brass bowl, and carried it without a tremor to the conservatory table. When Isaiah entered, not knocking, not hesitating, she did not look up from the symbols she was inking with a reed. "Is the timing exact?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "The sky will agree. The ground will answer. What was cut will be mended. And the cost?" Her pen hovered a fraction above the page. He regarded the tobacco stems on the table, the faint carvings, the darkened tips, then the bowl, then her hands. "All true exchanges have cost," he said. "But waste is not cost. We will not waste." She signed the page without a name, a mark in a language neither of the clerk's books nor of the parlor. The ink dried quickly, as if the paper had been waiting. That night the moon rose with a clean edge. The rose stood taller than any map had promised. At the first cooling of air, dogs in 4 neighboring yards lifted their heads and made the same single sound, then lowered them as if satisfied that someone else would keep watch. In the kitchen, behind a barred door, Bessie counted slowly to 100, and then again to 100. In the loft, Sarah pressed 2 fingers to the little pouch at her throat and found the iron nails inside warm. In the yard, a lantern guttered and went out without wind. Elizabeth lifted the brass bowl. Isaiah opened the door. They stepped into the night that would be remembered by those who survived it and by the land that never forgot anything. Night did not fall over Mount. It tightened. Air drew close to the skin, sounds thinned, and the moon rose with a clean, hard rim as if cut from metal. Elizabeth lifted the brass bowl from the conservatory table. Isaiah opened the door. Together they crossed the veranda without a word and stepped into the rows. From the loft above the kitchen, Sarah watched through a sliver where a board had warped. She had barred the door herself at Malachi's order and tied her salt and iron pouch so tight it burned her neck. Below, Bessie counted softly, breath catching on every 10th number. Somewhere in the yard, a lantern failed, drowning the path in a deeper dark. The field held its own weather. Sweetness hung over the tobacco, heavy and ripened past ordinary, braided with a second scent like wet wood pulled from the bottom of a river. The leaves were taller than a man, glossed as if they'd been fed light. When wind moved, it did not rustle. It whispered, edges of syllables without language. Elizabeth stepped between the rows in a plain white shift, hair unbound. Isaiah matched her pace, steady as if walking a line he had walked before. They reached the center, where stems had been faintly carved and the soil looked darker than the rest, as though it had been drinking. Sarah left the loft and slipped into the linen closet at the end of the corridor that faced the yard. Through the crack where the door didn't meet the jamb, she saw moonlight silver the brass bowl in Elizabeth's hands. The bowl caught that light and did not give it back. Chanting began. It was not loud. That was the first wrongness. Power on the plantation had always announced itself. Hooves, shouts, the crack of something meant to break. This voice ran low and even, a seam in the night. Isaiah speaking, Elizabeth answering, syllables passing between them like measured drops. The leaves leaned in as if to listen. Light flashed once, blue, not lightning, not fire, and the dogs along the road all gave a single bark, exactly together, as if cued. The sound folded into quiet so quickly that Sarah wondered if she had imagined it. Then the field breathed. The air cooled in a single draft from the ground up. Mist curled along the rows, low and deliberate, coiling around Elizabeth's bare ankles. Isaiah dipped the brass bowl and lifted it again. Smoke rose from it, though nothing visible burned inside. It smelled sweet at first, and then not sweet at all, like fruit gone too far and something beneath the fruit that remembered rot. Words threaded the smoke. Sarah could not hear them, but she felt the shape of their cadence pulling through the houseboards, tugging at the nails. In the kitchen below, Bessie stopped counting and began to pray in a language that did not belong to the church in town. Isaiah's voice changed, deeper, not louder, like a door had opened in his chest. Elizabeth answered in a cadence that matched, her tone low, her posture entirely without tremor. She lifted the bowl high. The smoke rose in a narrow column, met the blue light and bent. The tobacco moved, not all of it, only the carved stems, leaves shifting toward the column as if drawn by a magnet. The symbols along their skin glowed the faintest ember color, then cooled, then glowed again, like breath. For a long moment the field held there, as if listening for a yes or a no. The answer came as a sound more felt than heard. The earth under Sarah's feet thudded once, the way a heart announces itself in the chest after a hard run. The mist lifted. The smoke twisted in the bowl and streamed outward, not toward the sky, but into the rows. It entered the leaves the way a lung accepts air. Every window pane in the house rang, not shattered, rung, a thin, bright tone that turned immediately to silence. Sarah pressed the heel of her hand into her mouth to keep from shouting. Through the crack, she saw Elizabeth's face lift to the moon, blank and intent, eyes wide. Isaiah's shoulders squared, then loosened, then squared again. Like a man bracing against a wave he expected, and then another he did not. The blue light thinned and deepened by turns, as if a tide were moving across it. A second scent rose with the smoke. Salt, iron, something like the inside of a ship held closed too long. Sarah thought of the sea she had never seen and swallowed hard. Isaiah lowered the bowl. Elizabeth spoke alone now, a string of sounds so smooth they felt memorized. The words wound around the stems. The leaves shivered. The carved marks brightened once more, then sank into the green. When her voice stopped, the silence that followed felt shaped. Like a vessel waiting to be filled, it filled. The leaves drew in, visibly, horribly, veins darkening, edges quivering, every plant seeming to take a long, slow breath together. The carved stems pulsed. The mist rolled outward all at once, thin and blue and fast, spreading across the field in a fan and flattening into the soil. Cold rushed through the kitchen door crack and up the staircase and into the closet. And Sarah's breath smoked white in front of her face. Then everything went still. For 3 beats, long enough to count and not long enough to understand, nothing moved. The bowl did not smoke. The air did not stir. The dogs did not bark. The moon did not waver behind high cloud. It was a picture, and then it was not. A sound like ice shattering inside the earth cracked the stillness. Leaves blackened in streaks, not burning, not freezing, ruining. The sweetness soured into a metallic sting. A gust tore down the rows and out across the yard, slammed into the barred kitchen door, and blew the candles in the study sideways to blue. Sarah gagged, eyes burning, vision pricking with little white pins. When she blinked them clear, the center of the field was empty. Elizabeth stood alone. Isaiah was gone. She swayed once. The brass bowl slipped from her hands, struck the dirt rim first, bounced without a sound, and settled upright as if placed there. Elizabeth's eyes held open and unfocused, her face calm in the way a clock face is calm. She turned, slow, exact, toward the house and began to walk. Sarah fled the closet and scrambled down the back stair, fingers skidding along the railing. She met Malachi at the kitchen door as he lifted the bar. Wind shoved in when the latch gave, stale and cold enough to sting the teeth. They stepped into the yard together, Bessie behind them with a shawl over her hair and the kitchen knife still in her hand. The field looked wrong. Rows collapsed into each other where they should have held their lines. Leaves hung black as if an impossible frost had skimmed them. The soil in the center gleamed wet and dark, though no water stood anywhere. In the middle distance, something flashed dull blue and was gone. Elizabeth reached the steps. Up close, her eyes were not wild and not empty. They were unwitnessing. She passed Malachi without a glance, past Sarah, past Bessie, moved into the study and sat, her hands folded in her lap. Her breath came regular. She looked in every visible way like a woman pausing after a long task to rest. When Sarah said, "Miss Elizabeth?" there was no blink. When Bessie touched her wrist, the pulse was steady. When Malachi said her name the way a father says a child's full name when danger's in the yard, nothing inside those eyes looked back. They searched for Isaiah by lantern light. The northern cabin was as it had been, except for a neat coil of cord on the table and a small clay pot still warm to the touch. Near the field's center, the brass bowl waited upright, rim clean, the soil around it stamped by no footprint anyone could swear to. They looked for disturbed brush, for bent grass, for anything that would give the night a seam to pick at. They found only the ruin of leaves and the cold that did not belong to summer. By morning, the staff's fear had ripened into a kind of tight efficiency. They covered the field edges with canvas to keep animals out, hauled water to the kitchen, latched shutters, and made a list of neighbors to fetch. Malachi took a horse toward the lane and returned with a delivery man who agreed, after long hesitation, to go for the sheriff. 3 days passed with no orders from the study. Food left on a tray at Elizabeth's elbow was eaten only when someone lifted a spoon to her mouth and coaxed it past her lips. She swallowed and did not look. Once Sarah placed Elizabeth's diary in her hands. The fingers curved around the leather on their own. No page turned. The sheriff arrived on the 4th morning, hat in hand, eyes narrowing when the sweet sour smell hit him on the porch. He stepped into the study and spoke to Elizabeth as if she could choose to answer. He examined the field and barked at his deputy to mind the soil in the center. He asked questions in the kitchen that made Bessie's jaw set. He asked different questions outside that made Malachi's shoulders square. When he left, he promised a doctor and returned with one who pronounced the body sound and the mind. Elsewhere, Isaiah did not return. No one in the county admitted to seeing a man with amber eyes and ritual scars walking the road that week or the week after. The bowl, polished by hands that shook and then steadied, was wrapped in cloth and nailed inside a pantry shelf where no one would reach for flour and find themselves holding a story. On the 8th day, Elizabeth blinked once. Not a flutter, a deliberate closing and opening. Her gaze shifted to the window. Sarah leaned forward so quickly her chair scraped the floor. "Miss Elizabeth?" "Nothing." But as the afternoon light slid across the desk, Elizabeth's right index finger lifted from her lap and traced, slow and patient, a small shape on the inside of her left forearm, an oval crossed by a line, then 2 dots, over and over, as if reminding her skin of what it already knew. The house learned a new quiet. Outside, the blackened leaves held their ruin. Inside, the ledgers waited, the page for September 23rd still open, ink dry on a final line the staff could not read and would not say aloud. Mount had crossed a threshold, and the county would arrive at it soon enough. For Liturgy of Fear, that is where we leave the night. One body present without its owner, one man gone without a trace, and a field that breathed once and will not let anyone forget it. Dawn delivered officials, and officials delivered paper, affidavits, inventories, statements, all the busy handwriting of men who believe ink can net a thing that doesn't live on the page. Sheriff William Harrington walked the rows with a kerchief to his face, paused at the blackened center, and told his deputy to mark it off. The deputy obliged, but the stakes leaned by afternoon, as if the ground disliked being measured. Elizabeth sat in the study like a clock whose hands still moved though the spring was missing. She breathed. She swallowed when prompted. Sometimes her right forefinger traced a small sign on her left forearm. Oval, line, 2 dots. Patiently, like a lesson relearned each hour. When the county doctor arrived, he pressed and tapped and watched and finally said the phrase men use when they meet a locked door without a key. The mind is not at home. Mount did not halt. It pivoted. 2 days after the sheriff's visit, Colonel Mount's cousin, Theodore Pike, bookkeeper by habit, opportunist by nature, rode through the gate with 2 clerks and a habit of ignoring warnings that didn't come with a seal. He listened to Malachi's account without truly hearing it, sniffed the air once, and declared the crop salvageable. Isaiah's name was not spoken. Theodore's men cut what still stood, stripped what could be stripped, and stacked the rest. They loaded wagons by week's end. Bessie watched from the kitchen steps and whispered, "Don't sell that," to no one who could stop him. The first wagons rattled toward Savannah. The sweet, sour scent they trailed made dogs along the road lift their heads and then bury their noses under paws. Theodore signed receipts with a brisk wrist in a broker's office off Bay Street and walked out pleased with himself. The broker coughed into a linen square the rest of that afternoon and dreamed of waves, though he had grown up 40 miles inland. On the plantation, small strangenesses multiplied. A measuring rope laid across the yard came up 2 inches short when pulled the other direction. A rooster crowed at noon as if time itself had slipped. At night, when wind moved through the deadened rows, the sound had a shape like sibilance. Sarah kept to the roots Malachi marked with iron nails beneath the grass, and even then she moved quickly. News does not travel. It infects. By early spring 1847, private letters in Savannah and Charleston mentioned a novelty among gentlemen. Mount Leaf, cured dark and sweeter than most, the kind a man kept for an evening when conversation ran long. In parlors where portraits stared down at brandy glasses, men packed bowls and cigars with the new tobacco and smiled at the first draw. The smile did not always last. The symptoms stepped in order like a drill. First came the dreams, vivid places no map held. Red soil under a savage sun, a wide water, a forest where birds called names. Then speaking, a phrase in an unknown tongue fell from a man's mouth the way a familiar prayer does, already memorized by something older than thought. Then the slipping, minutes in which a man rose from his own chair and walked like someone else wearing his clothes. Servants noticed. Wives noticed. Doctors noticed last. In April, at a gathering in Savannah, Judge William Harrington, husband to Margaret, who had once warned Elizabeth on Johnson Square, stepped onto the terrace for air after a pipe of Mount tobacco and did not come back exactly. He returned 30 minutes later, speaking in a language no one present knew. When guests stared, he tried again in rough English. "I am Kessie Ado, warrior taken from Kumasi, mercy of no man." He could name a ship, a date, a captain. He could describe a village fire no one there had seen. For 3 days he did not know his wife. On the 4th, he woke on his own pillow with a headache shaped like tide, and a hatred for tobacco he could not explain. Physicians called the episodes delirium, contagion of the imagination, hysteria by inhalation. Privately, a few used other words and did not write them down. One, Dr. Everett Chambers near Richmond, collected cases the way a moth collector pins wings, carefully with a kind of reverence that was also hunger. He invited afflicted men to a house outside the city, where he kept tidy notebooks and listened to other lives speak through polite mouths. In letters to colleagues, he suggested, delicately, that the Mount Leaf had become a vessel, that something taken without ceremony had found a way to ride smoke back into rooms where it could finally be heard. Back at Mount, Theodore Pike kept selling. Money has a way of making men deaf. Malachi refused to step into the ruined center of the field. He walked its edge with iron in his pocket, and did not say aloud what he heard when the wind rose at dusk. Bessie salted thresholds and burned herbs the church would not bless. Sarah slept with her shoes on. On the 12th day of Elizabeth's stillness, the sheriff returned with a county order. The estate would be managed by Theodore until Mrs. Mount recovered or was declared incapable. Theodore received the paper with solemnity and the kind of appetite men mistake for duty. He moved his ledger into the study opposite Elizabeth. He wrote figures until dusk. Twice he glanced at her and shook his head in what he would later call pity. That night, Sarah woke to the smell of tobacco where none was burning. She sat up in the loft and saw, down in the yard, a tall figure walk the perimeter, slow, exact, pausing at each corner as if assuring himself of the boundaries. The moon lit his shoulders and not his face. When he passed the northern edge, the air cooled as if a cellar door had opened. He rounded the final corner and vanished as if the last line belonged to a different map. By summer, the private letters had become quiet inquiries and then instructions. Certain merchants were told, softly, to pull Mount Leaf from their shelves. A magistrate in Charleston sent a sealed note to Savannah's Board of Health. A physician in Richmond begged Dr. Chambers for caution. Chambers wrote back, "We are on the edge of understanding or of heresy. I intend the former." In October 1849, his house burned. He was found at his desk uninjured, eyes open and unwitnessing, the same absence Elizabeth wore like a veil. The bowl stayed where Malachi had hidden it, nailed behind a pantry shelf. Once, when a nail worked loose on its own, Bessie hammered it back with 3 strikes and did not look at what her hands might have revealed. The soil at the field's center scabbed over and then refused grass. Animals balked and broke halters rather than step inside the old edges. Surveyors sent by Theodore to plan new rows died by degrees of confusion. Their chains measured different lengths on different days. Their notes contradicted themselves, and one map labeled the ground unsuitable, in a hand that looked ashamed of the word. Elizabeth left, Mount in a closed carriage under a county order that used terms like care and best interests. Sarah packed a trunk without watching the hands that folded dresses and set it by the door. Bessie followed the carriage to the road and stood with her shawl tight, whispering a name that was not Elizabeth's and not Isaiah's, but something in between. At the hospital, a clerk wrote Mrs. Mount admitted, unresponsive. A nurse later said that when she brushed Elizabeth's hair in the afternoon light, she saw the woman's lips move once as if forming a syllable, too small to catch, too heavy to lift. Theodore lasted until the books balanced in his favor. Then the plantation slid free of him the way a wet rope slides through a fist. One day he held, and the next day he did not. He stopped coming when men who bought Mount Leaf stopped returning his letters, and a banker in town looked at him as if he carried a smell. A week later, the main house caught fire under no obvious cause. Flames took the veranda first, then the columns. The roof fell with a calm thunder. By morning, only the chimneys remained, 4 black fingers pointing at a sky that did not bother to answer. In the ash, Sarah found a fragment of paper fused to glass. The ink had run into ghost lines, but a single sentence still lived at the bottom margin. Written in Elizabeth's neat hand, the last thing on the last page before the night. Tonight we finish what was started centuries ago. The rest was lost to heat. If you are listening to Liturgy of Fear, understand this. Some stories step out of a room and keep walking. The bowl hidden, The woman housed but not home. The man missing and not gone. The smoke moving through parlors where no one knew the price. Mount had become more than a place. It was a path. We will follow that path next into the hospitals, the parlors, the letters no one meant to keep, and to the first time someone finally dared to write the word that fit: possession. Hospitals are built on the belief that everything has a name. The first time they wheeled Elizabeth Mount into the long ward. White walls, iron beds, windows that refused to open past safe. The staff searched for a label to hang on her silence. Melancholia, catatonia, shock. The words lay on her chart like coats draped over a chair no one sat in. She breathed. She swallowed when coaxed. Her gaze rested where light fell and did not climb to the faces leaning into it. A young physician named Jonathan Merritt watched longer than most. He was not the first to tap a knee and wait for motion, not the first to shine a lamp and study pupils, not the first to listen at the wrist and decide the river ran steady beneath the bank. But he was the first to admit in his private notes what he would not say on rounds. The body is tenanted. The tenant is not who we think. He kept his observation to himself for 12 years. Back on Mount Land, absence rearranged itself into rumor and routine. The chimneys of the main house stood like sentries over ash. Vines claimed the veranda steps that led to nothing. The field's center scabbed dark and refused grass. Surveyors came with fresh chains and left with fresh doubts. Theodore Pike learned how quickly a man can become unwelcome when a commodity turns to curse. The county stamped unsuitable on a map and called the matter closed. The land simply declined to be closed. But the story did not stay fenced. It traveled in tidy bales to Savannah and Charleston and Richmond, tucked in the pockets of gentlemen as leaf, dark, sweet, a novelty. It crossed parlors under portraits. It perched on the ends of pipes. It smoldered in cigar tips. It moved through lungs into rooms where the past had no permission and did not ask for any. The sequence announced itself with the regularity of a clock. Dreams first. Red soil, wide water, trees that spoke. Then the tongue, letting slip a phrase the mouth had not learned. Then the slipping itself. A man stepping forward inside another man's life and looking out through eyes that did not belong to him. Servants steadied trays. Wives steadied voices. Doctors steadied hands and wrote delirium with neat penmanship to make order out of rupture. Dr. Everett Chambers did not reach for order. He reached for pattern. He rented a house beyond Richmond, where the road ran quiet and kept it ready for men whose evenings had turned foreign. He recorded dates and episodes and words none of his schooling had given him. He learned to listen when a judge from Savannah introduced himself as Kessie Ado, a warrior taken at Kumasi in 1798. When a planter from Charleston recited without stumble the names of rivers in a country his maps did not show. When a broker from Bay Street woke crying for a mother he had never met. Chambers wrote a hypothesis thin as a blade. The Mount leaf has been made into a vessel. Smoke is the road. Memory rides it. He wrote that sentence once and then cautiously again. He wrote a third line he would tear from the page. If memory rides smoke one way, what else may ride it the other? His house burned in October 1849. He was found seated at his desk without burns, eyes open and unwitnessing. The patients in their rooms did not make it to the door. Officially, a lamp overturned. Unofficially, the county learned a new quiet. Meanwhile, the rumor of a man with amber eyes joined the roads like mist at low places. In Charleston, a preacher appeared among free black congregations, prayed in a cadence that wrapped scripture around older words, and left before anyone could ask his name. In Norfolk, a watchman reported a tall figure walking the docks at dawn. Scars like faded script on his forearms, gaze like a plumb line. In Baltimore, a patrolman locked a cell at midnight and smelled tobacco he had not lit. By morning, the cell was empty, and the officer on duty could not recall which key he had used or whether he had used one at all. No one could prove the man was Isaiah. No one could prove he was not. Elizabeth lived like a lighthouse with no keeper. Nurses learned her rhythms. Dawn was the hour her finger traced a small sign on her forearm. Oval, line, 2 dots, without looking. Noon was the time her eyes followed light along the wall as if reading it. Jonathan Merritt, now older, asked for her chart on the days he came. In 1858, he wrote a report he marked confidential and tucked among his papers. Mrs. Mount presents not the absence of mind, but displacement. On rare occasions, there is the sense of a watcher behind the eyes that is not the patient. It is patient. It waits. He stopped short of the word he meant. Another hand years later would not. Far from the ward, in rooms where money gathered, certain merchants folded Mount tobacco into burlap and carried it to city dumps under dawn's gray. Certain others hid a packet away in drawers, telling themselves they kept it as evidence. The evidence had a way of finding flame even when a man promised he would not smoke again. After he promised a second thing, to tell no one about the dream that felt more like memory than anything else he had ever remembered. Back on the land, the hidden bowl tried to remain merely hidden, but wood shifts. Nails work loose from patient grain. The day the pantry shelf tilted, Bessie's hammer rose before fear could. She drove the iron back in, 1, 2, 3, and did not look into the shadow where brass curved. She salted the shelf. She salted the threshold. She salted her own mouth to keep from speaking a name that had not been hers to speak. Sarah grew into her caution. She wore adulthood the way she had worn the little pouch at her throat, not as adornment, as defense. She married a man who could walk a property line without angering whatever slept at its corners. She taught her children not to cut across the old field, even when the shortest line was tempting. When asked by a child who the woman in white was at the edge of the trees at dusk, she said, "A trick of light," and closed the shutters early. In the spring of 1861, as war ground its gears into motion, a Baltimore police report circled among men who liked to know things first. Arrest of a man inciting unrest. Held overnight. Missing at dawn. No sign of breach. Guard on duty said the smell of tobacco preceded discovery. No smoking materials found. A captain wrote in the margin, almost as a joke, check the chimneys. He did not check. His house would later fill with smoke one evening when no fire burned in it. He moved his family 2 streets over and took his cough with him. That same spring, letters slipped north from Union camps telling small stories that never made reports. A guide who could pass through pickets undetected. A voice at a right shoulder saying, "Now," just before artillery found the wrong place to land. A tall man with a calm stare, who knew footpaths like lines on a palm and who, when asked his name, said only, "A vessel keeper." No one wrote that part down. Elizabeth's end was recorded because a ledger demanded something in the blank. In 1863, her body failed in an orderly way. Breath slowed, pulse thinned, warmth retracted from fingers inward. The nurse on duty leaned close, habit, not hope, and saw a flicker as if a shutter had lifted behind the eyes. The nurse swore, years later, in a whisper that made her cross herself as if to apologize for believing her own memory, that the patient spoke a single sentence in a voice deeper than her own. The exchange has begun. The clerk wrote general system failure and set the chart aside for filing. After the war, men who had once owned other men dreamed harder. Some woke with other names in their mouths and sought out the formerly enslaved with money or apology, or both because the dream would not stop until they moved. A few of those visits made the paper. Most did not. A preacher in Boston preached mercy and smelled tobacco in the nave, though the church had banned it. A woman in Philadelphia put her ear to a clay jar she found in a wall and swore she could hear a sea moving, where no water sat. By then, maps had learned not to argue with Mount. A northern investor tried to bless the land with a mill, digging uncovered stone set in a circle older than the house had been. Designs on it that looked like something carried across an ocean and married to something that had been waiting here. Workmen went missing into the circle the way a dropped pin goes missing into tall grass. The investor sold the deed at a loss and told dinner guests he had tired of the climate. Nearly a decade after Elizabeth's chart gathered dust, Jonathan Merritt died with his papers boxed neatly. In 1924, they were donated to a medical college by a relative who admired his handwriting. Among the case histories was the report he had kept under his own hand. Consciousness displacement. A watcher behind the eyes, patience. Students read it and called it a curiosity. One called it a warning and folded the page back gently before placing it on the stack. If you are listening to Liturgy of Fear, mark what the story has become by this point in its long breath. One woman living without tenancy. One man walking without witness, one land refusing to accept the map, and smoke carrying names back into rooms that had locked their windows. The bowl remains hidden, the field remains hungry. The road remains open in both directions. Next, we go where the record is thinner and the voices are not. To the scattered pages, the rumored journals, the sightings that rhyme across cities, and the sentence that will finally be written without flinch, possession, and another beside it that cuts deeper. Return. Archives are supposed to tame the past. Boxes, labels, dates, the tools of men who believe memory can be domesticated. In 1922, the Georgia Historical Society tried to place a leash on Mount. 2 researchers arrived with letters of introduction and the earnest certainty of people who have never been warned properly. They asked for deeds, probate, crop ledgers, the sheriff's file from 1848. The clerk brought what he could. Too much was missing. Pages had been cut from volumes with a razor's care. Dockets jumped months with no explanation. What should have been there, receipts, physician notes, the county's management orders, had either been recopied in a different hand or simply gone. One document stood between oblivion and forgetting. Excerpts of Elizabeth Mount's diary, copied by Sheriff William Harrington, before the originals vanished from the courthouse safe. The copy was unsigned, tucked into a folder behind a tax dispute, and marked with 3 letters. E.M. The final dated entry read like a throat clearing before a sentence that no one wanted to hear. Tonight, we finish what was started centuries ago. The line broke under heat-darkened ink. There was no continuation. The society men sketched the chimneys, 4 black fingers still accusing the sky, and went looking for testimony. They found Sarah, now older, now careful, who spoke in short lines that made long shadows. They found Bessie's daughter, who would only say, "The bowl was hidden right," and cross herself with salt. They found a surveyor's grandson, who said his grandfather's map of Mount wouldn't sit still on the table. The men left with notes and names and a sense that something in their boxes would not stay. Boxed 4 years later, in 1926, the county staked a road straight through the northeastern edge of the old plantation. Engineers walked the property with transits and chains and produced 3 contradictory topographies of the same ground. Where one map showed a steady rise, the second showed a shallow basin. The third labeled that same patch variable. The project engineer wrote a recommendation that felt like a hand withdrawing. Choose the alternate route. The county did. Mount learned to make cartographers doubt themselves. The most detailed intrusion came in 1954 when a team from Emory University rolled in with microscopes, recorders, glass vials, and the confidence of laboratory men who believed nothing in a field could surprise them. Soil cores taken from the ruined center tested like one thing on Monday and another on Wednesday. Nitrogen and carbon swinging as if the earth were breathing. Water taken from the creek edge showed organic compounds that did not simply degrade. They reorganized under observation, rearranging into new ratios as if following directions not written in any chemistry text. At night, the team left magnetic tape recorders running to catch frogs and wind. The morning playback carried voices, not speech, not quite. Overlapping whispers, English braided with something older, a call and response slurred by distance. When the lead researcher, Dr. Marion Prescott, replayed the tape alone, she wrote a private note to herself and sealed it in a folder. We are not measuring residue. We are being allowed to overhear an argument the land is still having with time. The tapes were filed. The paper was published in a journal too polite to say what the data felt like. Mount went on. In 1967, a developer with money and poor instincts broke ground for a housing tract at the western edge of the old property. Backhoes sheared new dirt from old. A crew boss pried a sealed ceramic jar from beneath a root mat and cracked it on a rock. Inside lay soil so dark it looked wet under noon sun. 3 men on that crew woke the next morning with thin, deliberate scars rising pale on their forearms. Oval, line, 2 dots. No wound, no blood, no pain, until someone asked who had carved them. The supervisor's grandmother from Beaufort saw the marks, went silent, and tied iron nails in little cloth pouches for the men to wear. The jars they found after that stayed sealed. The project died not from curses but from surveys and capital, maps that would not agree, banks that would not commit. The land returned to quiet because quiet will always be cheaper than explanation. The following autumn, a graduate student named Thomas Harrison from Emory, young, unwise, ambitious, petitioned to camp on Mount for 3 nights. He wanted folklore rendered into ethnography, ghosts translated into footnotes. He signed out a tent, a field notebook, and a tape machine identical to the ones that had collected whispers in '54. On the second night, October 17, 1968, his notes pinched into a hand that did not believe itself. 3:27 a.m., woken by woman's voice from direction of old foundation stones, clear as church bell, no wind, no insects, moon high. He wrote followed voice and then switched to block letters as if that might keep the world straight. Clearing, foundation visible, woman in white standing center. Eyes open, unseeing. He wrote her sentence as best he could, every letter careful. He has almost gathered enough vessels. He underlined the next line, presence behind me, turned, tall. Black man, amber eyes, forearm scars shifting, said, some debts can only be repaid in kind. Some exchanges require equivalent value. Some justice transcends time. The last words on the page wandered into the margin, as if the writer had been pulled sideways while writing them. Fingers became smoke, entered mouth. 3 years. I am becoming a vessel. A farmer found Harrison at first light walking along Route 17. Coat unbuttoned, face burned with wind, eyes carrying a story he could no longer speak. At the hospital he slept 30 hours. When he woke he could recite in a voice not his the names of rivers in a country he had never seen. He withdrew from the graduate program before winter and left for West Africa on a January flight. The university treasurer refused to reimburse. He arrived in Accra and then left the lines of any official record. His field notebooks, recovered from the camp, were boxed with Emory's earlier tapes. The note about vessels slipped into departmental mythology like a dare no one wished to take. Between those two, markers 1954's Whispering Reels and 1968's Unmoored Student. Small events kept the current moving. A fisherman near Tybee swore a fog rolled off the marsh smelling of tobacco, though no one on his boat smoked. A schoolteacher in Savannah woke from surgery speaking Twi for 3 minutes, and then never again. A retired sheriff, grandson of the man who copied Elizabeth's pages, told his son on a porch that sometimes he felt watched from behind his own eyes when he drove past the old boundary stones. He laughed when he said it. He did not drive that road at dusk, and everywhere the same rumor wearing new coats, a tall figure walking perimeters, a woman in white at the tree line, a sweetness in the air that turned metallic when you named it. People learned not to point. They learned to keep moving. They learned that on some nights the past is at your shoulder and wants you to know it still has hands. Mount refused development. Deeds traded hands. Creditors counted and recounted. Survey stakes leaned and fell. The ground accepted rain and refused plans. The county eventually lost patience with argument and renamed the acreage protected wetlands, which is how a government admits defeat without using the word. And yet not all returns were ruin. In 2003, a tobacco company executive with a taste for heritage varieties purchased a sliver of the old property with the tidy intention of growing authentic heirloom leaf. He lasted 1 season. By autumn, he had resigned, sold his shares, and founded a quiet organization with a loud purpose. Trace the genealogies of the enslaved.
Identify living descendants, fund their searches.
Pay for the records the state never bothered to keep. When asked what had changed him, he said he had come to understand that some debts cannot be paid, only acknowledged, and that acknowledgement is a kind of justice that makes other justice possible. People laughed at him in the way people laugh when they are uncomfortable. He kept planting. For every confirmed connection the foundation made, they placed a tree along the old Mount border. Each tree carried a small ceramic plaque with a name and 3 words: remembered, reclaimed, returned. On certain nights, the line of trees seemed to rearrange themselves a fraction, as if sidestepping into a pattern. In 2019, a graduate intern with a drone proved what the older residents already knew and did not say. From above, the trees formed an Adinkra symbol from Ghana, Sankofa, the stylized heart that means return and reclaim. If you are listening to Liturgy of Fear, mark how the shape resolves, archives that won't hold, maps that won't agree, science that overhears what it cannot yet translate. A man who learned that profit is not the only currency, trees spelling a language older than the plantation that tried to silence it. The bowl remains hidden, the land remains alert, the road for memory still runs in both directions, smoke one way, breath the other. Next, our final passage will open the last surviving journals. Meet the healer who called him the vessel keeper, and read the single unambiguous sentence Elizabeth spoke before she left. Then we will stand briefly and carefully at the edge where justice begins. Archives fail where living memory refuses. What survives are the pages people hide inside other books. In 1872, a healer in Savannah named Rebecca Carter kept a leather-bound journal in the back room of her boarding house, a way station that had once hidden travelers on the Underground Railroad and now held the sick until their fevers broke. The first half of her book is apothecary craft, poultices for lungs, infusions for grief, roots for women worn thin by hard seasons. The last quarter changes its hand. The script grows taller, steadier, as if the wrist has learned from a tutor. He visits at dusk and leaves before the rooster, Rebecca wrote. He teaches that the body cannot be mended if the spirit is not reclaimed first. I call him the vessel keeper. Her descriptions rhyme with rumors from port cities: unusually dark skin, amber eyes, ritual scars that appear to shift when the light moves, marks like the small sign Elizabeth traced in the ward: oval, line, 2 dots. He did not offer a name. He offered instructions. Rebecca's notes became a bridge. Plants most doctors called weeds received their right names, some West African, some indigenous to the low-country marsh. Woven into recipes that did not just cure, they returned what had been taken. She pressed leaves into the margins the way Elizabeth once had, and labeled them in both tongues. Between instructions, the vessel keeper spoke sentences she copied without commentary. Some debts can only be repaid in kind. Some exchanges require equivalent value. Some justice is older than law. Memory is a road if you make a vessel. Smoke goes one way, breath goes the other. The land keeps the tally. When acknowledged, the count can change. In December of that same year, Rebecca wrote what would become the last line in her journal. He says his work here nears its end. The vessels are almost full. With what was taken, dignity, identity, memory, power. When the exchange completes, he will cross back with the gathered essence. He asks only that we continue the keeping. Remembered, reclaimed, returned. She underlined the 3 words once. She did not close the book with a flourish. She placed a sprig of dried tobacco in the gutter and tied the journal with cord. A century and a half later, her building is a small museum of Southern black healing, shelves of jars, ledger pages behind glass, a worn wooden chair where she must have sat to grind roots. Visitors report the same 3 things, written in the guest book in different handwriting every week: the scent of tobacco with no source, whispers in rooms without speakers, dreams that feel like borrowed lives the night after their visit. The guide has stopped promising that the humidity plays tricks on the nose. Instead, she nods toward a case where Rebecca's final page lies open and lets the words shoulder their own weight. Back at Mount, the county did what counties do when language fails. It changed the map. Protected wetlands, a phrase that sounds like stewardship and feels like surrender, now covers the acreage where a house once measured status in columns. The chimneys are gone. The foundation stones sleep under scrub. The center of the old field, where soil scabbed and refused grass, hosts reeds that wave like a congregation. On certain nights, the line of trees planted by the descendants' foundation shifts a fraction of a degree. From the air, the pattern is unmistakable. Sankofa, the Adinkra for go back and get what was taken. The shape did not require permission to appear. It only required time. As for Elizabeth, the woman who signed a ledger on Johnson Square and opened a door she could not close, her sum is not the diagnosis on a chart. Her nurse's private note, preserved by accident, says this: at the moment of death, the patient's eyes focused as if a person had stepped into the room. In a voice deeper than I had heard from her throat, she spoke one sentence: the exchange is begun. Then the breath left. The face looked like a face relieved. Men filed general system failure. The line between ledger and liturgy did not disappear. It only fell below the threshold of what paper admits. And Isaiah? Officially no body, no record, no return. Unofficially, he is the seam that keeps showing in places that should be finished. A preacher whose cadence yokes scripture to older grammar gone by morning. A guide who moves refugees through patrols as if walking a remembered corridor. A watchman on a dock seeing a man with amber eyes step out of shadow, pause at the edge of a perimeter, then continue along it like a surveyor of borders the rest of us cannot see. In Rebecca's hand, he is simply the vessel keeper, workmanlike, patient, precise. The tobacco itself, seed, leaf, smoke, stopped traveling as a commodity and began to move as a medium. The men who hid a final pouch in a desk learned that secrets are vessels too. Those who confessed, to wives, to pastors, to clerks who could be trusted not to laugh, used the same words without coaching. It felt more like remembering than like dreaming. Some repented publicly. Some sent money to names they found in county archives. Some left town. A few learned a practice Rebecca taught from the vessel keeper's lessons. Acknowledgement. Names spoken aloud. Landmarked. Trees planted. 3 words inscribed where grandchildren could touch them. We end where we began, at the edge of a field that refuses to forget. The difference is understanding. Before, the story sounded like a haunting, punishment without purpose, a curse that traveled on smoke. Now the plot clarifies. What moved through Mount was not vengeance. It was accounting. What crossed parlors and lungs was not merely terror. It was return. If you stand on the old road at dusk, those who grew up nearby will tell you not to. And you should listen. You may see 2 figures where the property line once ran. A woman in white, eyes open but unwitnessing, and a tall man with ritual scars, gaze steady, walking the perimeter as if keeping watch for breaches time might try to make. Sometimes they hold shape. Sometimes they dissolve into smoke and drift toward the river, carrying a sweetness that turns metallic if you speak while breathing it. If you do risk the road, there are only 3 things worth saying aloud, and say them softly: remembered, reclaimed, returned. The wind will take the words. The land will know what to do with them. And if you are hearing this on Liturgy of Fear, know that a liturgy is not a story for chills. It is a practice for the living. We speak names because silence keeps debts open. We plant trees because roots write what paper loses. We keep watch because some exchanges take years, some lifetimes. The bowl is still hidden. The road still runs both ways. The tally is still being brought to balance. This has been Liturgy of Fear. If you are listening at night, name where you are and the time, because distance does not save anyone from memory, and hour does not protect anyone from return. When you sleep, if a dream arrives that is not yours, do what the vessel keeper taught. Listen, acknowledge, and carry it carefully until the exchange is complete.